The moment Alex Mercer stepped through the heavy wooden doors of the funeral home, a cold chill gripped him. The building was old, its walls creaking as if it had been standing for centuries, watching, waiting. The air inside was thick, oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath, afraid to let anything disturb its quiet. His shoes echoed across the empty hallway, the sound bouncing off the faded wallpaper that seemed to peel away in places, revealing layers of long-forgotten history. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that the building was more than just a place to care for the dead. It felt alive, as though it were watching him too. He had come here to start his new job as an assistant at Grimsley Funeral Home. It seemed like a simple enough task: work with the bodies, help out with arrangements, and keep things in order. But there was something unsettling about the place. Something that Alex couldn't quite put his finger on. His first instinct was to turn back, but he'd already accepted the job, and there was no going back now. "Mr. Mercer, welcome," a voice broke through his thoughts, and Alex turned to see a man in his mid-50s standing at the end of the hall. He was tall, his face sharp and angular, a strange quietness in his eyes. Mr. Hargrove, the funeral home director, extended a hand. His grip was firm, yet there was something in his eyes, something hidden, that made Alex feel uneasy. "Thank you," Alex said, shaking his hand. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mr. Hargrove than met the eye, but he pushed the thought away. The man seemed pleasant enough, though his demeanor was cold, almost as if he were putting on an act. "Now, Alex," Mr. Hargrove said, lowering his voice as if to make sure no one else was listening, "there are a few rules we follow here. You'll need to be careful, especially with the bodies." He paused, his eyes flicking to the dimly lit hallway behind him, as though making sure no one else could hear. "Never disturb them, and remember, they're not like you and me. Show respect. We treat them with the utmost care. It's important." Alex nodded, though a knot formed in his stomach. What did he mean by that? "Of course," he said, trying to sound calm. Mr. Hargrove didn't elaborate further, and the subject was quickly dropped. But as he led Alex down the dark corridor, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that there was something Mr. Hargrove wasn't telling him. They passed a large door, leading into what Alex assumed was the morgue. Inside, the air was cooler, the light dimmer. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. There was a strange smell, something he couldn't quite place, but it made his stomach turn. "Welcome to the morgue," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice now oddly reverent. "This is where the work happens." Alex tried not to let the unease show on his face. The room was filled with rows of cold metal tables, each with a body covered by a thin white sheet. Carmen Blake, the embalmer, was working at one of the tables, her back to him as she cleaned her tools. She was a tall woman with sharp features, her face stoic and expressionless. She barely acknowledged them as they entered. "This is Carmen," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice quieter now. "She's been here for years. She'll show you the ropes." Carmen barely looked up, nodding briefly before returning to her work. There was a coldness to her demeanor, as if she was so used to the sight of death that it didn't faze her anymore. She moved with a practiced efficiency, her hands steady as she worked on the body in front of her. As Mr. Hargrove spoke, Alex found his eyes drifting to the bodies on the tables. They looked so still, unnaturally still. He stepped closer to one of the tables, his heart pounding as his gaze lingered on the sheet that covered the body. For a moment, he could have sworn the body moved, just a twitch of the hand, or maybe it was his imagination. But no, the body was still, cold, lifeless. Alex quickly looked away, feeling an uncomfortable heat rise in his cheeks. He couldn't let anyone see he was getting unnerved. But as he glanced around the room, he couldn't help but notice that the eyes of the bodies, those cold, dead eyes, seemed to be staring right at him, watching him. "Is everything all right?" Carmen's voice snapped him out of his trance. She was standing next to him now, her eyes boring into him, unreadable. "You look pale. Haven't you seen a body before?" Alex quickly nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I've just never been in a place like this before." Carmen raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment. Instead, she led him to the back of the room where the embalming equipment was stored. "The bodies," she said, "are treated with respect here, and we never disturb them, ever. Not unless it's necessary. Understand?" Alex nodded again, though a part of him felt a growing sense of dread in his chest. Something about her words, they didn't sit right. But he forced the thought away and followed her instructions, helping her move a few of the tools into place. As the night went on, Alex found himself becoming more and more uneasy. The funeral home was quiet, but in that silence, strange noises began to echo through the hallways. A faint creaking, the distant sound of a door swinging open and closed. The whisper of a voice, so faint that he couldn't tell if it was real or in his head. He told himself it was just the old building settling, but every time he turned a corner, the whispers seemed to follow him. By the time the clock struck midnight, Alex was the only one left in the building. Mr. Hargrove and Carmen had long since left, and Alex was left alone, finishing up his last task for the day. The lights flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. The unease had turned into a creeping dread that crawled under his skin, making him feel like he was no longer alone in the dark, cold building. He stood by the morgue, his hand on the door handle, but something stopped him. The pull to return inside the room was so strong that he couldn't resist. He found himself walking back to the table where the old man lay. The body, covered in a sheet, seemed to loom larger than it had earlier. As Alex stepped closer, he couldn't help but glance at the body's face, the features pale and lifeless. For a split second, he swore he saw it move. The hand twitched, just slightly, but it was enough. Alex stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. He quickly turned on his heels and fled from the room, but the dread followed him. The whispers, now louder, seemed to be calling his name. His mind raced, his steps quickening as he reached the hallway. He was almost at the exit when the sound of something shifting made him stop. He glanced back over his shoulder, his breath catching in his throat. The door to the morgue was slightly ajar, the dim light spilling out into the hallway. And then he saw it. The old man's hand was hanging off the side of the table, its fingers just brushing the floor. His stomach churned. The body had shifted. It had moved. Alex stood frozen, his heart racing. The silence was broken only by the soft groan that escaped from the morgue. It was unmistakable, and in that moment, Alex knew with a sickening certainty that he was not alone. The dead were awake, and they were watching him. The next day, Alex's unease only grew. He hadn't slept much, not with the image of the old man's hand hanging off the table, the soft groan echoing in his mind like a persistent whisper. But it was the strangest feeling that gnawed at him as soon as he stepped inside the funeral home. Something wasn't right, more than just the creepy atmosphere or the moving bodies. It was the people, specifically Lyle Turner, the security guard. Lyle was usually a steady guy, the kind who kept to himself, but today was different. As Alex walked into the break room to grab a coffee, he noticed Lyle standing by the window, his eyes darting nervously around. His usual calm demeanor was gone. The older man was jumpy, wiping his brow like he'd been running, though Alex hadn't seen him move. "You all right, Lyle?" Alex asked, trying to sound casual, though the nagging feeling in his stomach told him it wasn't. Lyle startled, his head jerking around to meet Alex's gaze. For a second, there was something wild in his eyes, something Alex couldn't quite place. Yeah, I'm fine," Lyle muttered, looking away and shuffling his feet. Just tired, that's all." But as Alex made his way to the coffee machine, he caught Lyle muttering under his breath. I hear them every night. Can't sleep, can't get away." Alex froze, coffee cup halfway to his lips. He set it down carefully, not wanting to seem too obvious, but he couldn't ignore it. Lyle was clearly shaken, more than he was letting on. When Alex turned to ask more, Lyle quickly rushed out of the room, avoiding his gaze. The whole day, the weirdness kept escalating. The whispers, faint at first, were now present in every corner of the building. They weren't loud, but they weren't imaginary either. They were real as the chill that crawled up Alex's spine every time he passed a darkened room. He heard them as he walked through the hallways behind the walls, like the building itself was trying to speak to him. That night, after the funeral home had settled into its usual silence, Alex found himself alone again. The light above flickered and hummed, the only sound in the otherwise still air. His mind raced with thoughts of what he'd seen the night before. The twitching body, the hand. He had to know more. He was cleaning the back room, trying to push aside the thoughts of moving bodies, when the whispers started again. This time, they were unmistakable, clear as day. Alex. Alex. His heart slammed against his chest as he followed the sound, unable to stop himself. The closer he got to the shadows at the back of the room, the colder the air became, and the more the whispers wrapped themselves around his mind, pulling him forward. And then he saw her. Standing in the corner, bathed in shadow, was a figure Alex had never seen before. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, and her long hair hung loosely around her face. She was watching him. Who? Alex started, his voice shaking. Mara Quinn, she replied, her voice cold and distant. Her lips barely moved, yet Alex could hear her perfectly. I was. Like you, once. Alex felt his stomach twist, a cold fear crawling up his spine. He knew he'd heard the name before. The workers in the funeral home had spoken of her, but they always hushed up when the conversation turned her way. Mara Quinn was a former employee, one who died under mysterious circumstances years ago. Some said she had gone crazy, others said it was something darker, but they never told him more. I was here, she whispered, her eyes boring into him, and now I'm still here. You can't leave, Alex. No one ever leaves. What do you mean? Alex's voice cracked as he stepped forward, but something in him wanted to run. The bodies, she said, her voice taking on an eerie edge. They're never really dead. They move when the moon is right. They're trapped here, just like me. And now, so are you. Alex's mind spun with the words, trying to piece them together, but the pieces didn't fit. I don't understand, he whispered. They don't want peace, Mara continued, her voice growing darker. They want to move. They want to be free. And they'll use you. They'll use your fear to make you one of them. Before Alex could ask more, before he could get the answers he was desperate for, the shadows seemed to fold over her. In a blink, she was gone, vanishing into the dark room like smoke. Alex stood there, paralyzed, every inch of his skin prickling with the chilling sense that he was no longer alone in the building. Was it really Mara? Had she been a ghost, or just a figment of his imagination? He wanted to shake it off, to convince himself it wasn't real. But deep down, he knew. Something about this place, about what he'd just heard, had changed him forever. The whispers grew louder, now swirling in his head, urging him to look closer, to understand. He couldn't ignore them anymore. He stumbled out of the back room, his hands shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. As he walked down the hallway, a sound reached his ears, soft at first, but growing louder with every step. It was a low, guttural noise, like the scraping of nails against wood. Alex froze. It was coming from the morgue. He couldn't stop himself. He had to know. The urge to return to the morgue was too strong, and against his better judgment, he found his feet carrying him back. The door creaked open with an eerie groan, the dim light flickering above. But what he found was beyond anything he could have prepared for. The old man, the body he had seen the night before, was sitting up on the table. His pale, lifeless eyes were open, staring directly at Alex with a twisted, horrific grin on his face. His fingers twitched, and his mouth opened, letting out a faint whisper. "Help me!" Alex's legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to the floor in terror. His heart hammered in his chest as the whispers, louder than ever, seemed to surround him, coming from every direction. They were everywhere. The bodies. They were alive. In that moment, Alex realized with a sickening certainty, the funeral home wasn't just a place of death. It was a prison, and he was trapped in it. The dead weren't at rest. They were awake, and they were waiting for him. Alex couldn't stop thinking about the old man, the body that had moved. Every time he checked, it seemed to have shifted again. At first, it was subtle, his fingers twitching, his hand lifting just a little. But over the days, it grew more obvious. The hand was stretching out, reaching towards something, as though it had a mind of its own. Alex had to know more, but every time he got close, a cold dread filled him, like he was intruding on something he wasn't meant to see. The whispers were getting worse too. At night, when the funeral home was quiet and still, they would creep into his mind. At first, it was just a murmur in the background, but now they were clear, like the bodies were calling to him, begging for his attention. He couldn't escape the feeling that they were alive, trapped, desperate to break free. His dreams were filled with the old man, his pale, lifeless eyes following him through endless hallways, his mouth opening, as though trying to speak. But Alex couldn't understand. He could feel something pulling him in deeper, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, he found himself at the morgue again, staring at the body that seemed to grow more alive with each passing day. Desperation led Alex to seek answers. He couldn't keep living like this. The nightmares, the constant whispers, the feeling of being watched, it was all becoming too much. He went to see Father Tobias, the local priest, hoping for some kind of guidance. The old man lived in a small, dimly lit church on the outskirts of town, and when Alex arrived, Father Tobias didn't seem surprised to see him. He had heard rumors, just like everyone else. The priest listened as Alex explained everything about the morgue, the body, the whispers, and when Alex finished, Father Tobias sighed, rubbing his temples. "You've stumbled into something far darker than you realize, Alex," the priest said in a quiet, serious tone. "This funeral home was built on sacred land that was cursed long ago. The spirits trapped here can never leave. They're bound to the land, to this place, and the more you disturb them, the stronger they become." Alex felt a cold chill run down his spine. The curse? It was real. Father Tobias went on to explain that the bodies, especially the old man's, weren't just dead. They were souls that could never find peace. The funeral home wasn't just a place to store bodies. It was a prison, one that kept the spirits trapped, forever restless. And the old man was at the center of it all. If his body wasn't laid to rest properly, if his spirit wasn't freed, it would only grow stronger, more powerful. "The longer you stay here, the more you'll become connected to it," Father Tobias warned. "The curse will consume you. The spirits, they will call you, use you, until you're nothing but a part of their twisted world." Alex couldn't wrap his head around what the priest was saying. The idea that the body wasn't just a corpse, that it was somehow alive, was too much to handle. But Father Tobias's warning stayed with him. He had to find a way to stop this, to put an end to whatever had been unleashed. But how? When Alex returned to the funeral home, everything felt heavier. The air felt thick with dread, and the whispers were louder, clearer. He was becoming obsessed with the old man. Every time he checked the morgue, the body had moved again, its hand now stretched completely out, its fingers curling as though reaching for something in the shadows. The body seemed to be waiting for him. It was always waiting. Carmen Blake, the embalmer, was one of the few people Alex could talk to about what was happening. She was older than him, having worked at the funeral home for years. But when Alex started asking her about the curse, about the moving bodies, her face grew pale. "I've known about it," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I've seen things, heard things. But I stayed. I stayed because I thought the spirits would leave me alone as long as I followed the rules." She stopped for a moment, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "But with you here, Alex, things are different. The bodies, they're moving more than they ever did before." Alex felt his blood run cold. She had known all along, but she had kept quiet, and now things were spiraling out of control. Carmen's warning came too late. Alex couldn't turn back. The more he saw the body move, the more it felt like the old man was trying to communicate with him. The whispers weren't just whispers anymore. They were a constant, like a voice inside his head, urging him to listen, to understand. His obsession grew. The whispers never stopped, even when he tried to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the dead, their eyes wide with fear, pleading for release. But it was always the old man who stood out, his eyes never leaving Alex's. His mouth moving, though no sound escaped. It was as though the body was screaming, begging for something, but Alex couldn't make sense of it. Then one night, it happened. Alex had just walked into the morgue, exhausted from lack of sleep. His mind was clouded, and he couldn't focus on anything other than the body. When he looked at the old man, he froze. The body was sitting upright, its back against the cold metal table. The eyes were open wide, locked onto him. The mouth moved, but the words were indecipherable. But then Alex noticed something. A deep gash had appeared on the old man's hand, one that hadn't been there before. It was fresh, red, and oozing something dark, like ink seeping from the skin. Without thinking, Alex reached out and touched it. As soon as his fingers made contact, a jolt of energy surged through him. His vision blurred, and he was overwhelmed by a vision, a dark figure standing in the shadows, watching him. It was the gatekeeper. The vision was brief, but it was enough. The gatekeeper was an entity that controlled the souls of the dead, a malevolent force, dark and powerful. It watched Alex, its cold eyes piercing through him, and it spoke with a voice that echoed in his skull. "Your time is running out," the gatekeeper warned. "The souls are restless, the body is growing stronger, and soon, you will be one of them." Alex staggered back, his head spinning. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The whispers were louder now, surrounding him, drowning him. The old man's body was still sitting up, its eyes staring, its mouth open wide as if ready to consume him. It was no longer just a curse, it was a warning, and Alex was running out of time. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled away from the old man's body, the dark vision of the gatekeeper still haunting him. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The whispers were growing louder, their voices twisting in his head like 1,000 desperate souls calling for help. But no one could help him now. Not Father Tobias, not Carmen, and certainly not Vera Grimsley, the founder of this nightmare. He was on his own. At the edge of the funeral home, in a part of the building Alex had never noticed before, he found something strange. It was a hidden door, tucked away behind a stack of old, forgotten coffins. The air in the narrow hallway felt thick, almost as if it didn't want him to enter. But something inside him pushed him forward, pulling him toward it. With a deep breath, Alex forced the door open. The hinges creaked in protest, and for a moment, he thought he might be making a terrible mistake. The room on the other side was unlike anything Alex had seen before. The walls were covered in strange symbols, runes that seemed to writhe and twist as if alive. The air was heavy, thick with an energy he couldn't explain. It felt as though something ancient and powerful had been waiting here for years, biding its time. In the center of the room stood an altar, dark and worn, surrounded by candles that flickered with an unnatural glow. The shadows seemed to stretch toward the altar, reaching for it as if they were alive. Alex felt the pull, a force drawing him closer, and against his better judgment, he moved forward. His hand brushed against the cold stone of the altar, and as soon as he did, a voice whispered his name. It was low and guttural, the sound of it scraping against his bones. Alex. His breath caught in his throat, and he turned, expecting to see something lurking in the corner. But there was nothing but the flickering candlelight and the strange symbols on the walls. Then, the air seemed to change. The room grew colder, and a figure appeared before him, faint at first, but slowly becoming clearer. It was Vera Grimsley, the woman who had founded the funeral home all those years ago. She was a ghost, her translucent form shimmering in the dim light. Her eyes were sad, filled with regret, as she looked at Alex. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. The home was meant to keep the souls safe, but it became something else, a prison for the restless. Alex could barely speak, his throat dry with fear. "What do you mean? What's happening here?" Vera's ghostly form hovered closer, her pale hands trembling as she gestured toward the altar. "The spirits, they're bound to this place, trapped, and they're controlled by the gatekeeper, a force that feeds on their souls. It keeps them here, keeps them from finding peace, and now it wants you." Alex's stomach twisted. The gatekeeper, the shadowy figure that had warned him, it wasn't just a spirit, it was something much worse. Something that controlled everything in the funeral home. As if on cue, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and the shadows around the altar began to move. The air hummed with a low, vibrating energy. Alex felt the weight of something watching him, something so dark and terrible that it made his blood run cold. And then, the gatekeeper appeared. It wasn't like anything Alex had imagined. It was a shifting mass of smoke and shadows, its form constantly changing, like a dark cloud swirling in on itself. The room seemed to bend and twist around it, the walls warping and distorting, as if they were part of its own dark realm. A pair of glowing eyes stared at Alex, cold and unfeeling. A voice, low and gravelly, echoed in his head, as though it came from every direction at once. "Alex." The gatekeeper's presence was suffocating. Alex couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't escape. "You have two choices," the voice rumbled. "Submit to me. Become my servant. Take my place. The funeral home will be yours to control. The spirits will obey you. Or refuse and become like the others. Just another lost soul, trapped forever in this place." Alex's knees trembled. The idea of becoming the gatekeeper's servant, of controlling the spirits, was terrifying. But the thought of being consumed, of becoming one of the dead, that was worse. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but the words caught in his throat. The room seemed to close in around him. The walls pressed forward, the altar now pulsing with an ominous light. The spirits, the souls of the dead, were closing in. He could feel them, their desperate energy pressing against him. He had to make a choice. He had to decide whether to give in or face the wrath of the restless dead. But as Alex stood there, paralyzed by fear, he saw something that made his heart stop. Out of the darkness, Eddie Lopez's body appeared. Eddie had been a colleague of Alex's, someone he had known before all of this madness started. Eddie's body was lifeless, pale, and still, but his eyes were wide open, staring directly at Alex. There was something wrong about the way Eddie's body moved, something unnatural. Eddie's mouth opened, and in a voice that wasn't his, he spoke. "Don't run, Alex. Don't try to escape. The gatekeeper will have you, one way or another." Alex's blood ran cold. Eddie had disappeared weeks ago, and now he was here, controlled by the gatekeeper, forced to act as its puppet. His body was a shell, a vessel for the dark entity's will. The air in the room grew thick, and the spirits pressed harder, their cold hands reaching toward him. The gatekeeper's voice rang in his mind again. "You cannot escape. Not anymore. You belong to me." Alex felt a surge of fear, the weight of the decision crushing him. He could feel the darkness closing in, the weight of the spirits pressing against him, suffocating him. He didn't know what to do. All he knew was that time was running out. The gatekeeper was waiting for him to make his choice. And if he didn't, the consequences would be unimaginable. In that moment, the room seemed to pulse with energy, and Alex realized one terrible truth. No matter what he decided, the funeral home had already claimed him. Alex stumbled backward, his head spinning with terror. The shadows around him thickened, pressing in from all sides, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Eddie's lifeless eyes bore into him, empty yet filled with something menacing. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and Alex could hear the faint sound of whispers, like the wind crying through a graveyard. His heart raced. The gatekeeper's presence was suffocating. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. It felt as though the very building was alive, suffocating him with its dark, twisted energy. He needed to get out. But how? Just as his hope began to waver, a voice broke through the darkness. It was familiar, but it wasn't the voice of someone he'd expected to hear. Alex. He whipped around, his heart pounding in his chest. There, standing in the shadows, was Mara Quinn, the restless spirit who had warned him before. Her form was faint, barely visible, but Alex could see her eyes, sad, desperate, and full of longing. "I can help you," she whispered, stepping closer. Her voice sounded pleading, "but you have to help me first." Alex took a step back. "What do you mean? What do you want?" Mara's eyes darkened as she moved toward him. "I've been trapped in this place for years. I can't leave. I can't rest, but you can help me. If you help me escape, I'll show you the way out. You'll be free." Alex hesitated, his mind racing. Was it a trap? Could he trust her? The gatekeeper's power was growing stronger, the walls pressing closer, and Alex's fear was rising like a tidal wave. The spirits were closing in, their cold hands reaching out for him, their whispers louder, more urgent. Mara's gaze softened, and she took another step toward him. "Please, Alex, I don't want to be here anymore. Help me, and I'll show you how to leave. I swear it." Something in her voice made Alex's pulse quicken. She was desperate, just like him. But there was a nagging doubt in the back of his mind. Could she really be trusted? Was she using him, like the gatekeeper had tried to do? He didn't have much time to decide. The gatekeeper was waiting. "I'll help you," Alex said, his voice shaking. "But you have to promise me, no more tricks." Mara nodded, her form flickering in and out of focus like a fading memory. "I promise." Before Alex could say another word, a loud bang echoed through the room. He turned to see Carmen Blake standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling as she held a dusty old book to her chest. She had been watching him from the shadows, silent and distant. But now, she was stepping forward, her eyes filled with guilt and regret. "You can't trust her," Carmen said, her voice low. "She's not who she seems." Alex frowned. "What do you mean? She says she'll help me escape." Carmen shook her head. "She's just like the others. All of us, trapped in this place, bound by dark rituals. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just trying to help the dead, but now I'm cursed, just like the rest of us. She's using you, Alex. She'll drag you down with her. Alex's heart sank as the weight of Carmen's words hit him. Was Mara truly trying to help him, or was she just another part of the trap? His thoughts raced, but before he could process it all, a cold, unfamiliar voice spoke from behind him. You're running out of time, Alex. Alex froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Father Tobias stepped into view, his face pale, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. I've been waiting for you, Father Tobias continued, his voice smooth and calm, almost too calm. I knew you'd come to me eventually. You don't understand, Alex. All of this, it's all part of the plan. The gatekeeper isn't your enemy, it's your salvation. Alex's mind reeled. What are you talking about? Father Tobias smiled, but it was a smile that sent a chill down Alex's spine. The gatekeeper has always been the key. You see, I've been working with it, guiding its power for years. I wanted to free the dead, but what I've learned is that they cannot be freed. Not like this. I've seen the truth, I've seen the power, and now it's your turn to see it too. Alex's eyes widened with horror. You've been working with the gatekeeper this whole time? You're part of this madness? Father Tobias didn't flinch. I am what you've always needed. I can help you become part of something greater. The gatekeeper can offer you more than just freedom. It can offer you power, immortality. You can join us, Alex. You can be one of us. Alex's stomach twisted. He wanted to scream, to run, but he was frozen in place. The gatekeeper's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, like the walls were closing in on him, trapping him in this nightmare. The spirits were closing in, their cold fingers brushing against his skin, urging him to make a choice. And then Mara's voice echoed in his mind again. Help me, Alex. You can't trust him. He's lying to you. But was she telling the truth? Was she truly trying to help him? Or was she just another part of the gatekeeper's game, just another trick to make him fall into the trap? Alex looked from Father Tobias to Mara, the weight of the decision crushing him. The shadows around him were growing darker, thicker, like they were alive, and the spirits were reaching for him, their cold fingers brushing against his skin. The whispers were deafening, the voices of the dead crying out for him. He was running out of time. The funeral home was closing in on him, its walls pressing tighter, the shadows rising, and the cold fingers of the spirits pulling him in. Alex took a deep breath, his heart racing. He had to make a choice, and it had to be now. But no matter what he chose, it felt like there would be no escape. Alex's heart hammered in his chest as he turned away from Father Tobias, his mind racing. Every step felt like it could be his last, the walls of the funeral home closing in, tightening around him like the grip of a nightmare. The cold hands of the spirits were still there, brushing against his skin, their whispers clawing at his sanity. It was as if the building itself was alive, and it was determined to pull him under, to keep him here forever. But then, the air shifted. Something had changed. He heard it again, the voice. Soft at first, almost comforting, but then it grew louder. The voice that had been following him all along, the voice of the whisperer. Alex could feel the pull, the urge to listen, but something was wrong. The voice wasn't the same. There was no warmth in it now, only malice. Come back, Alex. The whisperer's voice hissed, its tone now dark and cold, like it had been hiding its true nature all along. You belong here. You can't escape. The gatekeeper is waiting for you. Return to us. Alex's breath quickened. He wanted to scream, to shut the voice out, but it was everywhere, echoing in his skull, crawling under his skin. It was too much. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape them. The funeral home seemed to be alive, like it was breathing, like the shadows themselves were closing in on him. He ran. His legs moved faster than he thought possible, his body trembling with fear. The shadows flitted at the edges of his vision, darting in and out as if they were watching him, waiting for him to fall. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, until it felt like it was all around him, suffocating him. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. Every turn he took seemed to bring him deeper into the labyrinth of corridors. The funeral home stretched on, an endless maze of dark, twisting hallways. He couldn't remember how he'd gotten here, or which direction he'd come from. The exit was somewhere, he knew that much, but where? Where was the way out? A cold chill ran down his spine, and he skidded to a halt. The shadows were no longer just flickers at the edge of his vision. They were solid now, reaching toward him like dark hands, curling around his feet, pulling him down. The walls groaned, the air thick with an unnatural pressure. It felt like the entire place was about to swallow him whole. His breath hitched. He couldn't keep running. The gatekeeper was too close, its power suffocating. But then, through the growing chaos, something else caught his attention. A door. It was small, tucked away in the corner of the hallway, but it stood out against the dark. The shadows were pulling him, but Alex couldn't ignore it. He moved toward it, pushing through the overwhelming darkness, ignoring the voice that screamed in his mind to stop. The whisperer's voice was a growl now, desperate and furious. "You can't leave. You belong to me. You can never escape. The gatekeeper will have you." Alex's hand trembled as he reached for the door. The moment his fingers touched the handle, a blast of cold air slammed into him, almost knocking him back. But he didn't let go. He twisted the knob and pushed the door open, stepping into the darkness beyond. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. The shadows stopped moving. Everything went silent. For a moment, Alex thought he was free, but then his surroundings started to shift. The room felt wrong, like he wasn't truly out. The air was thick with something unspoken, an unseen presence that made his skin crawl. He could feel it. The gatekeeper was here, close, so close. He turned around, and to his horror, the door had disappeared. There was no way back. The shadows, the spirits, they were all gone. But the silence was worse. It felt like everything was watching him, waiting. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked around. The silence stretched on, pressing against him like a heavy weight. And then, with a bone-chilling crack, the world around him shattered. He was back, but not where he thought he'd be. Alex sat up with a gasp, his body drenched in sweat. He was in his bed, in his own room. His chest heaved with panic as he scrambled to sit up, his mind still reeling from the nightmare he thought he had just escaped. The air was still, calm. His heartbeat slowly began to settle, but something didn't feel right. It was too quiet, too normal. He stumbled to the bathroom, his hands trembling as he flicked on the light. He needed to see. He needed to know it was over. But when he looked into the mirror, he froze. The reflection staring back at him wasn't his own. It was the gatekeeper's. The eyes were dark, empty, like a void. The face was twisted. Not his own, but a distorted version of himself, one that didn't belong. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His reflection smirked, its lips curling into a sinister grin, and then, the voice. The whisperer. "Welcome back, Alex," it whispered. "You're mine now." And just like that, everything he had fought to escape, everything he had hoped to outrun, was now a part of him. Forever. Alex's breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the mirror, his eyes wide with disbelief. His reflection, the gatekeeper's reflection, smirked back at him, its hollow eyes filled with emptiness. It was him, but not him. The face twisted, contorting into a grotesque parody of his own, the darkness leaking from it like smoke. He tried to move, to scream, but his body felt like it wasn't his own. He was trapped inside it, unable to break free. Every inch of him screamed for release, but the entity had already claimed him, consumed him completely. The more he struggled, the more the darkness seemed to tighten its grip on him. The room around him began to warp, the walls stretching and bending like soft clay. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the once familiar sights of his bedroom became strange and distant, like they were part of a nightmare. Shadows crawled across the floor, creeping up the walls, their shapes distorted and unnatural. Alex's heart raced in his chest as he realized that everything he had thought was real, his escape, his return to normalcy, was nothing more than another lie. The funeral home had never really let him go. The whispers returned, louder now, harsher, filled with a cruel satisfaction. They wrapped around his mind, drowning out his thoughts, urging him to accept his fate. "It's too late, Alex. You belong to us. Forever." The voice of the gatekeeper was everywhere, a deep, guttural hum that vibrated through the walls, the floor, the very air he breathed. He tried to run, tried to escape the nightmare once more, but as he turned, he found himself standing in the very same hallway, the hallway of the funeral home. The same cold, sterile walls, the same flickering lights, the same bodies lying in their caskets, waiting. They were always waiting. No matter how hard Alex had fought, no how far he thought he had run, he had never truly left. The cycle had only just begun again. His legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone as he moved down the hallway, his body no longer his own. He wasn't walking. He was being pulled, dragged forward by an invisible force, a puppet to the gatekeeper's will. His hands trembled as he reached for the nearest casket. Inside, a new body lay, pale and lifeless. But Alex knew, deep down, that it wasn't just any body. It was the next victim, the next soul to be claimed, the next person who would become part of this never-ending curse. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. "You'll never escape, Alex. You'll never be free. You will always serve us." His own voice, no, the gatekeeper's voice, spoke in unison with the whispers. The words echoed in his ears, filling him with a cold, unrelenting dread. He could feel the weight of the funeral home pressing down on him, its walls closing in. The spirits of the dead circled around him, their eyes hollow and empty, their cold hands reaching for him, pulling him deeper into the curse. With a final, horrific realization, Alex understood. There was no escape. The funeral home would never be empty. It was a cycle, a loop that would continue forever. There would always be new bodies, new souls to claim, and Alex, no, the gatekeeper, would always be there to welcome them. His reflection in the mirror would never again be his own. His body would never be his own. And the spirits would never stop calling him, never stop reaching for him, forever pulling him back into the darkness. As the world around him warped into chaos, Alex's mind shattered, consumed by the realization that the curse had no end. The funeral home would never truly be empty, and neither would he. He had become part of it now, part of the gatekeeper's eternal, malevolent presence. And as the shadows closed in around him, Alex's last remaining shred of hope died. The cycle had begun again, and this time, there was no one left to save him.